Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pollinator Week session on climate change and pollinators. We have some fantastic speakers on this issue here today, and it falls to me to do a little bit of an update and an introduction to you about the topic. Climate change, as we know, is moving forward apace and is subject to vigorous international debate at the COP this week. And of course, it affects all aspects of the natural world, and pollinators and insects and the plants they depend on are impacted and affected by changes in climate, whether that's increasing in temperature, increases in rainfall, all the other aspects that we're familiar with as effects of climate change. Insects and pollinators, of course, are a very diverse group of organisms with thousands of species, and the responses are not singular. So each individual species is often responding in a different way. Some species, as we know, are dispersing and spreading with climate change. Tree bumblebees, for instance, have spread over large areas where previously they weren't found, probably benefiting from some of the increases in climate changes due to climate change. On the other hand, work done recently in 2019 by Platts et al. Has shown that for most species of invertebrates and insects and flying pollinators, they are not keeping pace with climate change. So for most species, they are stuck in their climate envelopes. And work done on bumblebees across the Northern Hemisphere has shown very clearly why this. Bumblebee is quite a good example because they wear woolly jumpers. They like it cold. They need hibernation. And actually warm weather, while people might think, well, hot weather's good for insects, actually hot weather's not good for all insects, and bumblebees are quite a case in point. They don't occur in the tropics. And we've seen bumblebee distributions narrowing. So what generally is happening with bumblebee distributions is the southern margins are moving north as the species are become extinguished in the southern parts of their ranges due to changes in climate. But they're not moving north because of the highly fragmented nature of their habitats. So you're getting this situation where you're getting a crush in the distributions of the bumblebees. And we think that's happening to quite a lot of invertebrates. The science is still coming in. We're seeing also the fragmentation of the countryside in most areas of Europe, making it very difficult for many small animals to respond to climate change and to move around the countryside. And this has been identified by Vasilev et al. In 2021 as one of the key issues for pollinator conservation going forward, addressing the impacts of climate change and addressing the ability of species to be able to move through the countryside to address that. So we are very welcoming at BugLife of the moves by the European Commission in the new deal for pollinators to include buzzlines across Europe, which will improve the habitat permeability, putting stepping stones of wildflower areas. That should enable quite a lot of small pollinators to be able to better move and respond to climate change. So, while sometimes the public can focus on the more obvious invertebrates and their movements, as scientists and conservationists, we need to look at the health of ecosystems in the round and the impacts of climate change across all of those different areas. And while obviously the imperative is for us to reduce the levels of climate change and the pace at which that's progressing, we must also look at how we can mitigate the effects of climate change and enable our natural environments to adapt to a future that we've committed them to. That's a little bit of a background. We have today 4 speakers who have all arrived, and I can see them all here, so that's great. And I will hand over to our first speaker, who's Alexandros Papachristoforou. My apologies, I pronounce all your names diabolically badly, who's from the University of Thessaly in Greece, who's going to talk to us about the impact of climate on Greek beekeeping and rural areas. Over to you, Guilherme.
Hello, Matt, I'm sorry. Well, this is not Alexandros. I'm sorry for this. I I think I cannot really reach him, and I think he's having troubles in connecting. So I propose that you pass to Emmanuel, and then we will try to catch up with him later.
We'll try to get hold of Alexandros. Hopefully you'll be able to join us. As Noah suggests, we will flip over to Emmanuel Porcher, who's from the Natural Science Museum Paris in France. So we're going to start with the plants. Well, the plants are the basis of invertebrate life and pollination. That's where the relationship started. So let's start there with impact of climate change on plant phenology.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everybody. I'll share my screen. Will be okay. Are you seeing my screen? Yeah. So I'll give a broad overview of what we know about the impacts of climate change on plants, and also a little bit on the possible consequences for pollinators. And I'll start by asking why we should worry about climate change, and in particular, for example, variation in temperatures, given that all living organisms are submitted to large variation in weather conditions, as illustrated here for one town in Great Britain, with temperature that can vary by tens or dozens of degrees within a day. So why should a few degrees increase in average in temperature matter for living organism? And one response to that question is because all living organisms actually have a limited range of climatic conditions under which they can survive, grow, and reproduce. And this is called the climatic niche, or climate niche, as illustrated here. For example, for a theoretical species, there is a range of temperature and rainfall under which these species can survive. And if this is the blue area in the center of the graphic, and if you go away from these optimal conditions, then mortality increases until there are conditions under which no individual can survive. And these can be measured in a variety of ways, either the mean temperature or the maximum or the minimum. For example, for plants, the presence and the frequency of frost matters a lot. And also in terms of rainfall, for example, the number of days of drought during a year. And we are currently seeing some situations in which the weather exceeds this condition. For example, in France in 2019, there was a heat wave during which the temperature actually reached such levels that some plants, for example, here the grapevine, literally cooked during a single day, and most of the leaves were dead by the end of the day. So what does climate change do? It does lead the weather condition beyond these optimal conditions required for organisms to survive, grow, and reproduce. And especially it implies that extreme conditions are reached more and more often, as in the case, for example, of the 2019 heat wave. And also another important change is that it shifts the optimal condition in space, as illustrated here in France. So you will see that a lot of my examples are from France, but of course they apply more broadly, where you have the different average temperature areas with a constant average temperature in France. And if you picture a species that prefers, for example, the average temperature pictures in green here in the current condition, then if you look at what the different climate scenarios forecast for the upcoming decades, you will see that such a plant species preferring the green conditions will have very few areas with optimal condition, and also this area will have moved. So it is possible to forecast the impact of climate change on the future of plants and other organisms simply by combining two types of data: the data on the presence and ideally absence of a species through space, and data on climate, measured again as various indices of temperature and rainfall and so on. And using statistical model, we can detect whether there is a relationship between the climatic condition and the presence of, or the probability of presence of a species, so that we can produce maps of the areas where the climate is favorable for a given species. And this is not very interesting per se, but it can be coupled with scenarios of climate change that are produced by IPCC. And that enables the forecasting of where the favorable condition for a species will be within the next decades. So just one illustration here for a tree species, the European beech. You have the current favorable condition for the species, with the more red color indicating a higher probability to observe the species. And you can see that this species prefers cool conditions on like mountain tops in France. And the scenarios for 2050 and 2100 shows that the areas that will be favorable for the species within the few decades will be much reduced at the scale of France. And this can be done for a large number of species. And if the favorable conditions are reduced too much, then you can have species loss. And in general, it is possible to forecast the consequences of predicted climate change for many species. And here you have the outcome of one study over all of Europe, showing that there is an expectation of a large decrease in the number of species in different areas in Europe, with the higher decrease being in Southern Europe. However, a few caveats about these approaches. There are models that relies on a number of assumptions. Some of them are that either the species that are considered can move completely to track the optimal climate conditions, or they cannot move at all. These models also assume that the species cannot adapt to new climatic conditions, and major assumptions also is that there is no interaction among species. That is, a species does not depend on other species to grow and survive in an area. So given that, we know that the climate conditions will change. We know that they will change in space for species. So if populations can move to track climate change, then we expect a shift in the spatial distribution of the species to track their climatic niche. Otherwise, we can wonder whether the populations can maintain under new climatic conditions, which would be an adaptation to a new environment. And this can occur in two different ways, but I won't have time to go into many details about that, either with genetic changes in the population, which is called evolution, or without genetic changes in the population. And if they cannot move and they cannot adapt, most likely the only outcome is a shrinkage of the species distribution that can lead to extinction of the species. So regarding the movement of plant populations, we know that they can move. In particular, this has been documented following the last ice age, for example, here in Northern America, where you have the traces of pollen of, again, a tree species. And it can be seen that the population shifts north following the melting of the ice cap. So we know that plant populations can move, but major characteristic of the current climate change is that it is much faster than the past changes, in particular those that occurred after the last ice age. If we measure the speed of increase in temperature, it's actually 30 times faster now than it has been 10,000 years ago. So there is a question whether populations in general and plant population in particular will be able to track such quick increase in temperature. And the existing studies shows that plants can move to track climate change, but they can move only over relatively small distances. And in particular, they can climb uphill to track climate change. And in particular, in mountain forests, it has been shown that over the past decades, plants on average have climbed about 70 meters in elevation to find cooler climates. And this is also true. This is another way of measuring that, a study comparing how climate in red changed over the past decades and how the temperature preferences of plants in, again, mountain areas changed over the same period, and temperature increased by 1 degree on average. And the temperature preference of plants only increased by ½ degree, meaning that the plants seems to be able to move, but not fast enough. And in lowlands, the climate has changed about the same as in mountain, but the plants were not able to track this changing climate. So it appears that plants can move, but they cannot move everywhere. They move mostly in mountains, and in general, they're not fast enough. They move slower than the climate. So the next question is whether they can adapt to the new climatic conditions that they will encounter due to climate change. And one major change that is observed in many cases is a change in the flowering or fruiting dates of plants. Here you have an illustration with a panel of French vineyards, which have advanced the flowering date and the ensuing harvest date by, on average, 18 days since the 70s. But you have many other situations in which this has been documented. Here you have the outcome of a review over many analyses of the change in phenology of plants. And you can see that most of the plants respond to climate change by advancing their flowering dates. A few of them by delaying, but those are the plants that requires cold temperature for their flowering. So it seems that plants change at least their timing of their life cycle, and a number of other adaptations have been observed to climate change. For example, some species have changed character values to be able to tolerate more frequent and more severe droughts, and also to be able to grow or to benefit from the fact that the frost events are rarer. So in general, it seems that plants can adapt to changing climatic conditions. But the question is whether these adaptations are enough to cope with climate change. And here I'll go very quickly, but I have contributed to a study showing that the plants that cannot track the climate change fast enough are also the ones that decline more on average. So the plants that do not move fast enough, meet new climatic conditions, they tend to decline, suggesting that even though they can adapt, this adaptation is not enough. So this is roughly what I just said. Plant population, they can move, they can adapt to new conditions, but generally they don't move fast enough and they do not adapt fast enough. So the plant communities in Europe and everywhere else in the world are changing due to climate change. And the next question is, what are the consequences for plant-pollinator interactions? One possibility is that there is a temporal mismatch between the moment where plants are flowering and the moment when pollinators are active. And here, I don't think there is a strong scientific consensus. Some studies show that pollinators do shift their activity, but since flowers also advance their flowering, there is no strong mismatch. However, there are a couple of studies showing that in some situations, the advancement of phenology is not the same in plants and in pollinators, resulting in a mismatch. And this occurs when plants and pollinators do not use the same environmental cues to adjust their phenology. And finally, it is likely that the ongoing changes in plant communities will affect the resources available for pollinators due to the spatial and temporal changes in where plants are and when they flower. And also something I haven't said so far, but climate change has an impact on morphological and physiological characters of plants. For example, with higher temperatures, some plants tend to produce less nectar and with a lower sugar concentration, so lower quality for pollinators. And I'll finish quickly because I'm out of time. So my conclusion is that in general, the available data suggests that plant population can partly cope with climate change, but not enough. That this will have consequences for plant-pollinator interactions. Just a reminder that climate change is not the only driver of current biodiversity loss. There are many other drivers, and in particular, habitat loss. And this knowledge have implications for conservation. In particular, it's important to try to conserve as much as possible large populations with a lot of genetic diversity to favor adaptation to climate change. And possibly, when adaptation is not possible, think about helping population move to track favorable conditions by population translocation. And I'll stop that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. That was fascinating, if slightly depressing, obviously. We're going to open up for questions. So please post your questions in the chat or put your hand up. I can't see everyone from here, but I assume Noah can will indicate when there's a question coming out from the audience. I guess a first question from me, Emmanuel. You know, you said that some of the models looked at sort of no dispersal and some of them looked at perfect dispersal, and obviously neither of those things are going to be true. And plants in particular have quite complex dispersal, don't they? Because it's not only the seeds where they have seeds, but it's also the pollen actually that can disperse genes without the plants themselves moving. Is there much research happening now to try to better understand dispersal of plants and how plants may, different plants may be capable of dispersing to new areas, whereas other ones may not be? What's the what's happening with that as a topic?
Yeah, there is a lot going on. Most of the dispersal occurs through the seed, though, because in general, well, pollen grain alone cannot produce a new population. But pollen dispersal is important for the connectivity among population and maintaining genetic diversity. But there's some research out there showing that plant population can move relatively quickly thanks to rare events of long distance dispersal, in particular for plants that are where seeds are carried by animals. And you can have dispersal of several, like hundreds of meters per year, but of course in a non-fragmented habitat or landscape.
Great, thank you. We have a question in the question and answer thing. Unfortunately, in my box I can only see half of the name. I think it's Stoyan something or other. I can only see the bottom bit of your name, I'm afraid. But you mentioned that climate change is not the only reason to move. Could you be more specific, is the question.
I don't know if you refer to my conclusion slide, but I wanted to mention that climate change is not the only reason for biodiversity loss. And I was referring to, for example, habitat loss being one major cause for plants and pollinators. So that was the main point.
Okay, thank you.
Matt, here in the room, we have some questions
Yes,
as well.
go for it, Noah.
Okay, so two things. First of all, thank you very much for this fascinating, really, presentation. And the first question is if we can have access to this, because I think it's worth being spread around. We should think more about the issues you presented. And the second one, we understand very well after this presentation in which way climate change has an impact on plants and animals. But I would like to ask if you think that among the causes of climate change, we can also include the anthropic interventions specific to modern agriculture. For instance, if some of the practices specific to intensive agriculture and especially pesticides could lead to a faster climate change.
So I'd be happy to share my presentation if you like. And regarding the second question, I'm a bit outside of my field of expertise, but yes, we know that agriculture contributes to climate change, particularly via emission of greenhouse gases, and also by contributing to deforestation in some areas of the world. So there is a direct impact of agriculture on climate change, and plus it's likely that the direct impact of agriculture on plants and pollinators also interacts with climate change. It's probably less possible for plants and pollinators to move through space in highly intensive agricultural landscape. So response to climate change will be more difficult with intensive agriculture, I suspect.
Thank you, Mania. We've got one more question in the question and answer, which is from Manon Philippe. It says, yes, for conservation, but if climate change goes that fast, should we consider planting new species while helping local species move north? How interventionist should we be about?
Yeah. I don't have a definite answer to that question, because if we start being interventionist a lot, then the local populations will not have a chance to adapt. So I think the main priority is to try to conserve large populations as much as possible and give them the chance to adapt to new conditions. And if that doesn't work, then yeah, we will have to do the job ourselves and help populations move.
It's a real challenge, I think, for nature conservation. That one, an interesting point, I think, to end on. It's it's a real big challenge. I remember people proposing buckets of biodiversity where we might have to just pick up biodiversity and just move it in buckets around the place to try to enable it to adapt. Who knows, maybe we'll get to that point. Now, is there any more questions in the room, or shall we move on? Okay, we shall move on. So next up we have from Belgium, Guillaume Gisbane, probably mispronounced that one appallingly as well, talking about the impacts of climate change on wild pollinators. He's from UMONS in Belgium. Over to you, Guillaume.
Hello, can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Yes, that was a yes.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Perfect. So hello everyone, my name is Guillaume Gisbane. I'm a conservation biologist working at the University of Mons in Belgium. I'm going to talk about the impact of climate change on wild pollinators. So we know that societies around the world are using immense, insane quantities of resources, and this is transforming ecosystems worldwide. Ecosystem, terrestrial lands, freshwater ecosystems, oceans, and it's also affecting climate, of course. We talked about that already a bit earlier because of the use of fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels to power engines, generate energy. We are emitting greenhouse gases. CO2 is often mentioned, of course, as an important gas, but there are many others. During the question session, there was a question about agriculture, and yes, it's involved in climate change because it releases high quantities of N2O, nitrous oxide, which is actually 298 times more powerful than CO2, and also methane, CH4. So as a consequence of this immense quantities of greenhouse gases, well, since these greenhouse gases absorb part of the energy radiated by Earth, well, climate is warming. And not only warming gradually, we'll talk about this, but there are also a lot of drastic climatic and weather events that are happening. And amongst the victims of this change in the climate, but also in habitat, as Emmanuel said, well, there are insects. We are today in what we call an insect apocalypse, because so many insects are declining around the world, and it's particularly well reported in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, in the United States also, but it's very likely that it's all around the world. And we should be very worried about this, because when we're talking about pollinators, well, most pollinators are insects, not all of them, but most of them. And around 90% of the plant species worldwide depend directly on animals for their pollination. So if there's a decline in these pollinators, there's of course a big impact on plants. And if we're talking about crops, crop plants, it's about 75% that directly rely on animals. So it's a lot. And as Emmanuel said, the thing is, insects depend on very precise, insects and plants actually depend on really precise climatic conditions to accomplish their life cycle. So when we're talking about life cycle, it's about emergence, but also flying to find resources, flying to find suitable habitats, reproducing, developing as eggs, developing as larvae, developing as adults. And so if these conditions are changing, of course, there will be an impact on insects. And there could be actually 3 potential impacts of climate change on insects. The first one, but we can rapidly stop thinking about it because it's not real for most of them, it's adaptation. Many people think that pollinators will adapt to climate change, but no, and we will see why many of them can't do that. It's because climate change is first way too fast, and it's because it's not only about gradual increases in temperature, it's much more than this. The second option for pollinators is that they can migrate. And like plants, some pollinators indeed can migrate even long distances. But unfortunately, it's only a very small fraction of pollinators that are physiologically able to migrate. If you have a very small pollinator, it requires a lot of energy to fly long distances. If we're talking about bees, for instance, they can't really go that far from their nest, wild bees, solitary bees. And so the last option after adaptation and migration is basically dying. And we mentioned a bit earlier, and I think it's a very good example, bumblebees. So I'm mostly a specialist of bumblebees. That's the pollinator group I know the most. And they're a very good example of a group of pollinators that are strongly declining. Bumblebees are basically the polar bears of bees, right? They're adapted to temperate climates, cold climates. And so in a warming world, well, they don't go well. There are, for information, approximately 70 species of bumblebees in Europe, and there's already a quarter of them that is threatened. And I will show some works a bit later. It is projected that more than 75% of the bumblebees that are not threatened today will actually be threatened in the next decades. So there's really a big problem with this group. And this group is actually essential especially in the Northern Hemisphere, because they're cold adapted. They are one of the most important groups of pollinators. And only a very small fraction of bumblebees are actually able to migrate to higher latitudes. We mentioned earlier the tree bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum, but unfortunately it's more an exception than the rule. Think about the fact that, as Emmanuel said also, the main cause of that biodiversity loss today, including in pollinators, is not directly climate change, but it's climate change plus habitat loss. Habitat loss through severe fragmentation, through habitat destruction. This is the leading cause of biodiversity collapse today. So imagine an insect that is actually able to migrate. This insect might end up in a habitat like this one, severely fragmented, destroyed basically, highly polluted with diverse types of pesticides like insecticides, can be also herbicides, fungicides, acaricides, helminticides, a cocktail of killing molecules, plus other stuff. Other stuff can be heavy metals. It can be molecules that derive from plastic, like phthalates, and all sorts of molecules. So even if we think about some insects being able to migrate, they might arrive in places like this. They might arrive in hell, actually. So we should not be too optimistic with the fact that physiologically some insects, some pollinators are able to migrate. If we really want to help them, we need to protect the habitats where they could migrate. Otherwise, they will never be able to establish in these habitats. Most importantly, when we talk about climate change and pollinators, there's something critical that we must think about. Climate change is not only about gradual increases in temperatures. Climate change is also about drastic events, extreme climate and weather events. These events can be fires, they can be storms, hurricanes, flood events, droughts, they can be mega droughts, so droughts that last for a very long time and on a large area. And we have to think that these events are becoming more intense, they're becoming more frequent, and they last longer. And this has, of course, immense impacts on insect populations, especially on pollinators. Think about this. Back in 2003, there was a very big heat wave in Europe. It killed approximately 70,000 human beings. Imagine if something is able to kill human beings. Human beings are able to, find places where to hide from the sun. They're able to buy food. They're able to buy water. They are able to help others. For insects, that's not the case. So imagine if it's killing 70,000 human beings, how many insects died? How many pollinators died? And think about the fact that most insects, especially in temperate and cold regions, they basically stop functioning at some temperatures, basically 40 degrees. After 40 degrees Celsius for bumblebees, it's going really bad. And during heat waves, it's not uncommon to see temperatures like 47 degrees Celsius. In Portugal, it's been the case more than 45 degrees in places in Italy, like in Sicily. So the impacts of these events, especially if they're repeated year after year, and sometimes it's a drought, sometimes it's a heat wave, well, it's having immense consequences on both plants, pollinators, and of course, their interaction. What are the impacts of heat waves, for instance, on pollinators? Well, they can be many. One of the impacts can be that the insect dies directly. Another impact can be that it alters their cognitive functions. So they don't work well. They can't find their nest anymore. They can't reproduce anymore. Or it can also affect their fertility. It's called a sublethal effect. So the insect is still able to fly, still able to find a mate, but the fertility is lowered. So there's no next generation. So this is a series of maps from paper we have published recently with colleagues who are climatologists, colleagues who are modelers, and experts also in bumblebees. And there are two important things to see on this map. The first one is this map here with an arrow. What is red is basically the places where there has been a historical drop in ecological suitability for bumblebees in Europe. And our models actually show exactly what is known from the literature. So Central Europe has been severely affected, and a lot of bumblebees have gone regionally extinct, and their abundance also has dropped significantly. In Belgium, 20% of the historical bumblebee fauna has already disappeared completely, and another 20% is critically endangered. There's another arrow here. So on the right part of the slide, you can see a series of maps. These are projections for the future. So when it's red, it's bad. When it's blue, it's potentially good. And we will see that it's only potentially good because it will not be the case. So here you have a diverse scenarios of global change, SSP 1, 3, and 5, and different years up to 2040, 60, and 80. And the projections basically say that in the worst case scenario, we could have more than 75% of the bumblebees that today are considered fine, that could actually lose more than 30% of suitable habitat in the next decades. That's huge. You can also see some places that are blue. They could look like a good sign. We could think, okay, they're refugia. Well, maybe not. Actually, these models make the assumption of full dispersal, and a lot of bumblebees are absolutely unable to disperse to higher altitudes and latitudes, especially because of habitat fragmentation. And we also have to think that these models cannot take into account extreme climatic events. So events like droughts, mega droughts, floods, hurricanes, heat waves, we cannot predict them. We cannot know if next year there will be a heat wave. It's impossible to predict. So these models are actually very optimistic. And that's the very bad news about models. They look horrible, but they're super optimistic. We don't know if we will create, new pesticides, new insecticides that will further kill biodiversity. We don't know if there will be new invasive species that will share their parasites with these bumblebees. So we need to keep in mind that what we can project for the future is always very optimistic compared to what's really going on. I talked a lot about bumblebees because I love them and because I study them all the time, but other pollinators are declining drastically. There's an example here with hoverflies. You can see that the large proportion of them are declining because of climate change, but especially because of changes in agricultural practices and the way we basically manage our environment, because we're destroying microhabitats. It's also the case for bumblebees. They require flower-rich areas, and we are destroying these areas with a cocktail of toxic molecules. Interestingly, we talk a lot about bees, but if you look at the last IUCN assessment of bees, well, you see that there's a fraction that is declining. But the very worrying thing is that for more than half of the bee species of Europe, we have no idea. 56% of the bee species are currently data deficient. And many papers have shown that data deficient animals have a higher probability of being threatened than non-data deficient animals. Partly because, a lot of data deficient animals are localized in places where there's no researchers studying them. And also, if we have no information on them now, it's also because some of them have already declined and they're becoming rarer and rarer. So just to conclude, climate change is having drastic impacts on pollinators, on wild pollinators. We always have to think as climate change in two ways: gradual increases in temperature, but above all, extreme events. And we should focus on that a lot because these events are not predictable. This means that if we want to protect pollinators, we need to make sure that despite the fact that these events will happen, we need to restore and protect nature for, the environment to be at least suitable in terms of land use, because there's a lot of impact of climate change that unfortunately we will not be able to manage. So we need to make sure that habitats are protected. We need to be sure also that habitats are connected to each other, because when you make small insect populations, genetic diversity drops, there's inbreeding, and this could also lead to extinction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow. Thank you, Guillaume. I mean, that was brilliant, but awful. Brilliant, but awful talk. It's grim. It's grim, really, isn't it? And, I'm working for a nature conservation organization that focuses on insects. I'm sort of used to some of this, but hearing it even from me, it remains a grim situation that we're in. And, we have to hope that those people over in that debates in Saudi Arabia are taking these sorts of issues seriously, because it is grim. And I guess, we just heard from Emmanuel Porter around plants not moving. And I guess, if you're able to add that into your models, that adds yet another big problem for the insects, because, you talk about bumblebees and hoverflies, they're quite general, but actually a lot of the solitary bees are quite specific, aren't they? And I guess, they'll have additional problems, won't they?
Absolutely. That's a very good remark. So the models don't take into account the plants moving or not, which is an additional threat for bumblebees, right? And we often think as bumblebees as generalist animals, but we've been showing for years now, and we've published a paper in 2021 showing that a lot of species that appear to be generalist species because we see them a bit everywhere, they're actually tightly associated with some plants like Fabaceae, for instance. And in Europe in particular, we are putting larger and larger quantities of nitrogen in the soil. Our soils are being, there's eutrophisation that is more and more important, and that prevents a lot of plants that bumblebees love, like Fabaceae, to actually grow. So this is something that is not taken into account in the models, and that could add an additional layer of threat to these already endangered organisms.
I haven't got any questions in the question and answer session. Noah, are there any hands in the room?
Yes, we have. Please, so put your microphone, and then the rest will be able to listen to you and to see you.
Hello. Thank you. About the nitrous oxide, it seems to be a very big factor. Can we have an idea per every ton or every hectare that is planted, what is more or less the impact when nitrogen is used as a fertilizer? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I did not really understand the question. It was about fertilizers and nitrogen.
Yes. If we can more or less understand what is the impact of every hectare that is under agriculture with nitrogen fertilizers.
Yeah, so I'm sure we could find in the literature exact numbers for every hectare as you suggest. I don't have the number off the top of my head. What I can say is that a lot of wild pollinators rely on plants that are in oligotrophic soils. So plants that grow in poor soils. If you have soils that are enriched in phosphorus, in nitrogen, basically prevents these plants to grow. And that's a very big issue. We can see the impact of fertilizers already around Europe. You have probably walked, on a road where there were a lot of Urtica. Sorry, I have the name in Latin, but not in English. Urtica dioica.
Metal.
This is basically not normal. It means that there's a lot of nitrogen in the place. You have also seen maybe rivers that are greenish. This is the impact of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we can sometimes see the impact like in small places, but we have to understand that there is an excess of nitrogen all over Europe, especially where there's intensive agriculture. And in these places, we can see a correlation with the decline of bees like bumblebees, and it's very clear on maps. The maps I showed earlier, where you can see a decrease in bumblebee suitability in Central Europe, it's also where there's a lot of excess of nitrogen and fertilizers.
Any other questions over there now? Oh, we've got one in the chat. Let's go to that. So Mamta Sharma asks, in tropical countries, there is a lack of baseline data on pollinator assessment. So how a secondary database study can be conducted and how useful are GBIF in this area?
Yeah, so I don't know much about pollinators in the tropics. I've done a postdoc in Panama, actually. I've been working on butterflies, but not as pollinators. It was just a model for evolutionary biology. But what I can say is, yes, from my knowledge, there is much less knowledge about tropical pollinators, and that's a big issue. For bees, bees are not mostly associated with tropical climates. So the places with the highest bee diversity are actually in very dry places. But there are, of course, a lot of pollinators in the tropics. You mentioned GBIF. So I've been checking a lot of data, bee data from GBIF. I mean, it can be very problematic, because the identification of bees, for instance, depends on very big expertise in identification. And when you check the data on GBIF, a lot of these animals are identified wrongly. So for bumblebees, it's very clear because bumblebees are big, you see them everywhere, and people think that they can identify them on the field. It's mostly not the case. You cannot, because a lot of them are cryptic species. And with GBIF, we are seeing an increased number of erroneous pollinator data across the globe. And it is especially true for bumblebees. For many other bee species, we are currently updating the red list of European bees. It will be published in 2024. And when we use GBIF data, we're like, oh my God, this is like so wrong. So part of it is excellent. It's an excellent initiative. But unfortunately, a lot of non-experts are adding data to these platforms. And that is a very big issue when people try to use them for scientific papers, for instance.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I mean, I think we should probably move on at that point because we want to get in at least 15 minutes sort of chat and discussion at the end. And we have one more speaker to fit in. Now, we were going to have Anna Ganapini from Canapi Bee Life in Italy talking to us about the impacts of climate change on beekeeping products, diversity and production. We still have the same talk and we still have the same organization, but we have her colleague here, Alexandra Gianelli, who's going to give the talk. Over to you, Alexandra. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity of being here. And let me share my screen. So first of all, okay. Can you hear me? Perfect. So, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Alessandra Giacomelli, and I'm working for the Italian National Beekeepers Association, UNAPI. And UNAPI is one of the founding members of Bee Life. That is the European Beekeeping Coordination, the old international NGO that deals exclusively with pollinators. And this speech is prepared by Anna Ganapini, that is a member of the largest organic producer cooperative in Europe, the CONAPI. So this is a forehand speech. And lots of your questions will be answered by her at the end of my speech. And I'm really glad to be here because Emmanuel and Gilliam, your speech has been really brilliant, both of you. And we are really in the same direction. So in our speech, I'll try to give you the idea of the impact of climate change on bees and honey production. So first of all, I will show you which are the first effects of increase in average temperatures and the more frequent episodes of extreme events, as Guillaume has previously reported. And where are these extreme events being experienced? In a really fragile and Mediterranean area, the Italian peninsula. In fact, in late spring, we are suffering more and more cold weather returns in a period where bee colonies are really extremely populated and they need a humongous nectariferous and polliniferous resource So suffering these heavy temperatures reduction or even frost episodes, what is it bringing? Is it bringing to a completely total zeroing of the spring honey productions, including also the valuable Robinia acacia honey? And this sprout that you can see in the picture is undergoing a really bad thermic shock, and its flowering cycle is completely interrupted. The same situation occurs in southern Italy on citrus plants and on Sulla coronaria cultivation. In recent years, the most profitably, we are so sorry for that, the most profitable only honey harvest for beekeepers have been totally compromised due to the several suffered frosts. But unfortunately, this extreme event is not only the only one that we are having in Italy. In fact, also drought is one another serious extreme event because it occurs in extremely prolonged periods of time, and it persists. It falls seasons after seasons, and this is really something that is stressing a lot the sustainability capacity of the beekeeping sector. So what is happening? We are facing in the middle of the harvesting period this lack, this shortage of nectar, and this shortage also of pollen. And we also are hardly managing to ensure water supply to our colonies. Unfortunately, do you know what beekeepers need to do in this situation? They are forced to use emergency nutrition on their families to avoid fated losses. But this is not only extreme events that occurred in our peninsula. And you're going to be a little bit shocked from the incoming photos, because in the middle of May, in the middle of spring, in May 2023, these are the floods that happened in Emilia-Romagna region. And the ravage, it's totally clear from the shown photo. Now, let's talk about another extreme event that also Guillaume has already reported. In Italy, as in other Mediterranean countries, temperature peaks reached over for several days and for many hours in the day. And this is strongly influencing the survival of the colonies and even leading in the worst situation to their losses. But why? So, you know that traditionally temperatures is measured 1.6 meters from the ground, but the hives are located around 30 centimeters from the ground. And do you know what those mean? That means that the reach temperatures close to the inside the hives and outside the hives can be more over 50 Celsius degree due to the sun glare. And I would just like to point you that bee wax melts at around 64 degrees. Give some practical idea. This is the situation in the middle of summer 2021 in Sicily Island, in Siracusa, Sicily, in the Siracusa province, and we reached the temperature of 48.8 degrees. Let's take a look to what happened to the bees. Around 3,000 colonies suffered reported losses. So we have seen totally entire apiaries losses. We have seen the population of the bee families, swarm colonies, dripping honey, melted honeycombs, and dramatically asphyxiated families. That is what we have been reporting. The same situation occurred again in Sardinia, in the other Italian island, in this last summer. It's in the middle of July, and the situation has been due to a persistent head bubble. And another time, around 3,000 colonies have been touched in that head bubbles, and mostly of them died because of asphyxiation, with the loss of entire apiaries. Again, it's really, really dramatic. But the Italian beekeepers as all the other beekeepers, can stay with their hands without moving them? Of course not. And so taking also the Spanish colleagues' advices, because they have suffered the same issues since ages. What are they doing to overcome heat waves? So, for example, they're placing the hives in wooded areas or shaded place to facilitate the temperature management, or they're maintaining, and they don't cut the grass under the hives, but to avoid fire risk, of course, don't let it grow too much. And this is to retain humidity and to obtain lower temperature. What else? They paint the hive lids in white color to the light reflection. What else? Maintain strong and healthy families, even in this period of the time, to have efficient internal hive ventilation. And moreover, they place supers on the brood nest, even if there is no harvest going on, so they have more dispersion of the heat. And they use closed bottom hives. So this is what is happening on bees. But let's have a look to what happens to the honey quality and to the characteristics. So it's well known that in tropical climates, the honey is normally very moist. But in Italy, we're experiencing the same issue more and more and more often. So spring honey, such as the Sulla coronaria one, is really often found with humidity higher than 19%. And the same issue is also present in the coriander honey. That is a summer honey, and never before has had issue with the humidity. And we're finding it more and more with higher humidity. And now we have to take another look on the honey characteristic and quality, because unfortunately the Robinia honey, it's really often stained by spring honeydews that has a darker color. And with this situation, it is not a proper Robinia honey. And the same issue is also taken with the citrus honey, even if it's just marginally. So what else? It is not easy to adapt to the taking place shift. First of all, because it's difficult to perceive the new reality. What the beekeepers are really understanding is that there is an increase in the critical issues. And now we have just listed it and summarized it, just to let you know what we are facing. We are having colony losses. We are having increase in the honey production costs. Survival of the beekeeping sectors it's at risk. And just think about its impact on the entire ecosystem and agriculture sector. But there is always a but we can surely set in, and we can surely do something in this complex context. We need to recreate a productive environment. And so just let me give some ideas. For example, we can ask for a radical agriculture policy reform. We can ask for an agroecological approach. We can reduce the impact of herbicides and pesticides. And of course, we need more nectar and more pollens for bees and pollinators. Now, we are reaching to the conclusion of my speech, and I would like to point out that already in 2019, BeeLife proposed a measure to be adopted within the CAP to incentivize farmers to promote the well-being and proliferation of pollinators. And in Italy, fortunately, thanks to the UNAPI and the BeeLife movements and really speaking all together with all the agricultural part and the environmental and NGO, we have to speak all together, because this is the only way we can win regarding to the Ministry of Agriculture. So what happened? The Italian Ministry of Agriculture has received our solicitation, and it has implemented this measure, an eco scheme with specific measures for pollinators. And this is an incentive for farmers, and it is per hectare and per year. And what do they need to do? They need to maintain the soil coverage with nectariferous and polliniferous species from the beginning of March till the end of September. And if you are doing it on a natural protected area, you will have more money. There is even an incentive of it. What else? What do the farmer needs to do? They don't. They do not have to use pesticides and herbicides. The weed control can be realized just mechanically, and you can't move the soil. What else? Okay, this is what something that I didn't need wanted to lose. We have some preliminary data on the first year of this eco scheme in Italy, eco scheme 5 in Italy, specific measures for pollinators, and we totally achieved the goal that we wanted, because it had been applied on an area of around 70,000 hectares, 30% of it implemented in natural protected area, and the other 70% in not protected area. So the challenge is to be able to guarantee biodiversity without compromising the farmers' income, of course. And now we're clearly a humongous effort is requested by the farmers, because they have to achieve a cultural change and a new concrete attention to the environment. For that purpose, the eco scheme has been presented together with guidelines that suggested how to seize the opportunity and convenience of cultivate nectariferous and polliniferous species following an agroecological approach. And finally, I would like to point out that in Italy, we're facing a lot of difficulties to define an experimental insurance policy to protect beekeepers from the lack of honey production. It represents an innovative product for the beekeeping sector, because it is completely split from the emergency measures with social and environmental purposes. So I conclude my speech, and I would like you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And after we've heard the desperate scientific situation we're in with the natural environment, it's good to also hear you come out with a bit of fighting talk there about the need for us to all sort of do whatever we can to both raise profile of this and to make sure that solutions are put in place. You froze for a moment for me, and you froze at the point where you were telling us about the temperature at which the wax melts. I don't know if you froze for other people.
64
degrees.
Degree. Yeah, I'm sorry. I hope it was just the only point that I was frozen.
And so some of these hives, if they're low to the ground, they're getting a lot of solar radiation, and they're getting up to those sorts of levels of temperature, are they?
Exactly. And all the bee combs, all the combs are just crashing down because of the heat. It's incredible. It's dramatic.
Yeah, must be terrible. I haven't got any questions in the question and answer thing. Noah, are there any hands in the room?
Yes, there are, Rams.
Yes, I have a question. First of all, I have to declare that I envy you very much for what you achieved in Italy with that. It looks like it's a wonderful achievement to have this eco scheme. I like, as you say, that after the implementation of the first year, you have about 70,000 hectares already benefiting from this eco scheme. Can you tell us also how many farmers really applied, if you have this data, and how many of them were conventional farmers, not ecological, not organic?
Okay, let me see if I can find it quickly, or maybe let's ask Anna if she already has it knowing by memory. Let me see.
Je vais parler en français, excusez-moi. Nous avons demandé cette information au ministère de l'Agriculture, mais nous sommes encore... nous attendons encore une réponse. Ce sont des détails qui ne sont pas encore publics.
We asked for information, but we haven't yet received the reply to our request.
Me either. I'm sorry, but I couldn't find the answer even here.
Any other questions, Noah?
No more questions here from the room. So I don't know if people in the like remotely can have questions.
Mhm.
Sorry, I lied. There is one question.
Speak A or speak B? Yeah, B. Yeah, you hear me? This is a question for the butterfly and bumblebee researcher. Have you any information about the tropic zones in the Earth, at the Earth? Also the rainforest. What happens there?
So, it's a question for me, right?
Yep.
Shall we just
Yeah, okay.
pause because why don't we take that, because if we can just finish with Alexandra's questions, then we will have a discussion session at the end, and we'll take your question as a starting point for that discussion. That's okay. Let's just make sure that Alexandra's had a fair crack at the whip. I've got one little question if no one else has got one. Alexandra, how are the sort of professional beekeeping associations across Europe and further afield? How are they reacting to the threat of climate change? You know, are they mobilizing and getting lots of engagement with decision makers around this?
Of course, we have as BeLive, we are really trying to be close to the decision makers person, and to stress them of the emergency impact that all these extreme events shall have on the beekeeping sectors and on the wild pollinators also, both of them.
And are they listening, do you think?
Noah, what do you think about it?
Slowly. I think there is a must to bring more information from the field to the authorities, and this is what we are doing actually. So all these observations that our members are doing, we try to document them and then to bring them to the European authorities. So this is an ongoing work and something that we do, but it is true that I mean, here people don't really understand the dramatic situation that is observed. I mean, they understand, but like in terms of, I think it's a must of that we have to do is to translate this into, okay, this is catastrophic, but what does it mean in terms of my production? What does it mean in terms of the cost I'm going to incur and the lack of production that I'm not producing? And even like this summer, all the fires that were, for instance, in Greece, the amount of dead beekeepers that actually were caught in the fires and actually died. I think, well, this is the kind of information that we are bringing to the institution, so they do something. But afterwards, the how to implement practical measures. It's again, we are sent back to the member states because all the action capacity is at the member state level. So, but anyway, like we keep on bringing all this information to the authorities, so there is an action.
We have a question in the question box from Francesca Pratelle. It's probably the broadest question I've ever seen fielded. Is the honey production and well-being status of bees all the same all over Europe? Now, would you like to tackle that? What sounds like a question that might take you 3 days to answer, but you haven't got 3 days. Is honey production and well-being status of bees all the same all over Europe? I guess are the threats of climate change to bee production? I mean, it sounds from what you were saying that much of it's focused in the Mediterranean area where the really high temperatures are hitting, but I guess there are threats in other parts of Europe as well.
I don't know, maybe if, Alessandra, you have much more the Italian view. Maybe I can answer for the European. So that there are of course different impacts in different places. The sectors or the countries that are much more touched, and here I have in the room, so people coming from all over Europe, so they are going to be able to give a little bit more detail on that. So the countries that are, of course, much more affected negatively, because here there are different trends, I would say, the countries that are negatively affected by the impact of this crazy weather that we are having now are mainly the southern, the Mediterranean countries. That actually are also the largest producers at European level of honey. So so there it is a dramatic situation, and I think this year it has been a severe drop from the, no, it was not a drop in the, well, in Spain there was a drop. Okay. So, but yeah, here we have the expert, and they have discussed this last week. So yeah.
Yeah,
And flooding, I guess, must be an effect some places as well.
yeah, it's a special situation because you have to know that the two last year were very good beekeeping year on the production, but what you have to see is the distortion of production between the north and the south part of Europe, or even from the east part and the west part. Everything is changing very quickly from one year to another year, but the average of production in France this year was very good, and more or less everywhere in Europe. So but you have to know that in the Mediterranean region, this was completely horrible, and years after year they get a lot of problem. And the presentation of the CONAPI was really clear in this field. You see that they don't know what to do, and they ask some specific subvention to continue to produce, to try to produce some honey in the south part of Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain, even the south part of France is directly touched by this kind of phenomenon. But in opposite side, you can see an increase of production in the north part of Europe. So it's a kind of compensation there. And the big problem for the beekeeper today is the 1 year they produce a lot of product of honey, and the year after nothing. So it's the variability of the market is changing very quickly. And what they explain there is the type of honey produced are changing very quickly too. The professional who produce some monofloral honey today is not absolutely not sure to continue to produce this kind of honey, because the acacia is not acacia. We have a lot of change. The color is changing, the taste is changing. And for the market, it's very hard to adapt yourself to the market, because the consumer, they can't understand this kind of things.
That's great. I think you've covered off. It's a complex picture by the sounds of things, but that's really useful, important information. Thanks for that. I think it was okay. I was going to say thank you to Alessandra for your session, and we'll move on to a discussion session. So if Manuel, you want to put your camera on, and we've already had one question from the floor around what's happening in the rest of the globe and tropical areas in terms of climate change and pollinators. And Guilherme, maybe you'd like to start by addressing that. Let's try to be quite succinct and see if we can get around a few little topics in the next quarter of an hour.
Yeah, so I will answer with my knowledge and my field of expertise. So I'm a bee researcher, and bees are mostly diversified in arid areas and hot areas. So I don't know much about the tropics. But what I know about tropical bees is that they are fully understudied. Thing that, to get a bit of perspective, the first really annotated checklist of the wild bees of Europe was published this year. The very first checklist had been published in 2014, and the real update was this year. So if even in Europe, which is one of the best studied places in the world for pollinators, we have so many changes in checklists and only publishing like updates now, you can understand that in the tropics, well, we basically have no resource and basically nothing is known.
There's very little. I mean, species aside, there's very little as well on abundance, but there has been some fragments of stuff. There was some work done in Puerto Rico, which showed really profound declines in the numbers of flying insects entering traps, and that, you know, assumed to be linked to climate change, but really, you know, not enough evidence. So outside Europe, the picture gets fuzzier. I think it does, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Puerto Rico is actually a good example, but it's an exception to the rule because it is well studied. The first checklist of Puerto Rican bees should actually be published in the next year or next 2 years. I know the person doing it, and it's very difficult for that person, for that PhD student, to get information about the bees because it's so understudied at the moment.
I mean, even in the UK, until very recently, we didn't have much abundance data. It was all distribution data. It was points on a map, and that sort of distribution data massively underestimates changes in abundance either up or down, because you see one bee and that's a dot on the map. You see 10,000 bees and that's still a dot on the map. So you can have big changes in abundance. And in the UK, we have a scheme that we run at BugLife called Bugs Matter, where people drive and clean their number plate and count the numbers of insects hitting their number plate. And that's shown a shocking decline of 64% loss in the number of insects hitting their number plates in just 18 years. And the data, we're working on the data for this year. We now repeat this survey every year. And basically, at the moment, we're losing about 5% of the abundance of insects every year. Now, this is activity density, and as was actually the Puerto Rican study, as was the stuff in Germany. Activity density measures look at not how many of the things are there, but how many of those things are moving and being intercepted by monitoring. And the complication there is that as populations get fragmented and become island-like, you might think that the solution, whether you're a plant or whether you're a bee, is to get better at dispersing. But actually what happens is they get worse at dispersing, because as Guilherme said, there's all this difficulty in between. There's a hostile environment that they've got to go into where they're going to die. So if you've got long wings, if you've got strong flight muscles, if you've got a will to disperse, you end up dying and your genes are taken out of the population, and you end up heading back. It's like the Galapagos studies of Darwin, isn't it? You end up with islands with flightless animals on, because if you leave that island, there's nowhere to go to. So that's an added difficulty you've got, and another reason why putting in place the buzz lines, I think, is a really solid solution to that issue. Any other points from the panel that you would like to make at this point, having listened to what the other panelists have said?
Sorry, Matt, can I ask a question to Emmanuel?
Please do.
Yes, I would like to ask Emmanuel, with her observations, if there are any recommendations that can be done observing what is happening with the plants. Any practical recommendations that we can do to favor the increasing of so given that all these phenology is changing and that we are having less resources, what can be done, let's say, from the plant side?
Conserving wild plants as much as possible, but then we can also act through planting. And I think a lot can be done to put more nectar-rich species, both in farmland and also in private gardens. Like really simple things, not having only alone in your garden, but also an area where you let plants grow, wild plants, but also planted species. And there are documents out there providing lists of species that are rich in resources for pollinators, that are ideally local. And there are really a number of things that you can do in your gardens, and also that can be done in farmland to diversify the availability of resources, and to make sure that resources are available all year long during the period of activity of pollinators. So this is one option.
Manu, when you look at sort of the policies and the proposals around the continent, what are the ideas that you think that could really help with this situation? What inspires you to think things might get better?
I'm not sure I understood your question regarding the
in terms of policies and legislation and things like that. where do you think the solutions lie here? What makes you think there's hope? If we do these things, then the plants may be able to survive better.
Yeah, well, the EU directive on restoration of habitats, that would be lovely if it was as ambitious as it was in the beginning. This is one example of something that would work.
Yeah, I think we probably all agree on that, aren't we? Nods around the
Yes,
table,
sorry,
you know.
Matt, and if I can
restoring
say
habitats.
something super,
Yeah.
if I can say,
Go on, Noah.
the NRL passed today.
Oh,
in
wow. Great.
So that's brand new news from this morning. No, I think it was it passed. So today there was a vote at the European Parliament, and it seems that there was a support from the Parliament. So good news, at least from this for today.
I mean, I think there was concern that some of the agricultural side of it had been rather watered down. I don't know if you've got any more specific news on whether any of that changed or whether it was just passed as it was standing. These European processes can be a bit complex.
Well, we'll
Not
see,
sure.
but at least, well, one step at a time.
Good. Any last comments from the floor out there? You've got a question there, Noah?
Actually, yeah, people are getting active now.
Well,
Okay, if there is still time, I like to make a short comment on the opinion expressed by Etienne Bruno a bit earlier. That, well, I don't know, probably you have complete data, but from what I see as a testimony from the field from Romania, most of the beekeepers complained that year 2023 was a very bad beekeeping year. Most of them obtained just a small fraction of the production they had the previous year. And they blame, of course, weather conditions. So we have experienced more and more cold springs, drought in summer, warm autumns that really may have an impact on beekeeping. And from this perspective, so Romania is on the latitude of 45 degrees, northern latitude. So we are somewhere in the middle. And my rhetoric question actually is there any, can we be, well, not very worried because now there is a compensation in the northern part of Europe where it is a higher yield of honey production, whilst in the south it's less. What will happen when the climate change will increase? Do we have any reason to be optimistic, or we should be more worried because sometime the northern part will also start being impacted the same as the southern part of Europe? Thank you.
We have to think what we are doing because later we were following the summer, as I come from Sweden then. And now spring is earlier and autumn is later. What do we do about that? You can't harvest in August and then lock them up and say, now it's winter. Doesn't work. We can do a lot of as beekeepers too to this. Finished.
yeah, well, there certainly are a lot of factors at play
I
here.
still have another comment.
You got-
So
you got
here
another
now
one?
they
We've
are
got time to fit
statements,
one more in, have we,
not,
Noah?
not questions.
Just a quick question to Emmanuel. How effective do you think that the planting of corridors would be in helping plants and insects, for that matter, migrate towards the north?
I'm not sure I can give you a precise answer to that.
We cannot hear you, Emmanuel.
Do you hear me? No?
I can hear her.
Maybe their speakers are turned off.
I think the problem's at your end. We're fine here. It might just be the four of us who are fine.
It seems that we have a problem here in the room, but it's because you can hear each other, but we cannot hear you.
I cannot write the answer. I don't think so.
I assume we've probably got the online people still with us. There's a paper published from the University of York, Hodgkins, a few years ago, which focused on dispersal of organisms across the landscape. And they looked at different patterns of habitat dispersal. So if you had an amount of habitat and you scattered it across the landscape, what would be the different responses of species in terms of dispersal? And it was quite interesting because with grassland, with open grassland habitats, they actually found the biggest effect in terms of a corridor. So the dispersal improvement that you got from putting your wildflower grassland into a corridor was 5 times greater than if you put it in a scattered approach. So effectively, for the same investment, for the same improvement of area, you got 5 times better dispersal simply by targeting your activity within a corridor rather than randomly scattering it across the countryside.
Okay, well, you had a much better answer than mine. Thank you.
Noah, are you hearing us? Are you hearing us? Calling Brussels.
No, they're
we
asking
are-
to close the meeting.
We are
Okay.
actually listening to you.
Yeah.
We are listening to you in my computer. So everybody's coming close to listen what you have to say. So don't worry, we will, I mean, we are very frustrated because we didn't get the answer. But we will have to view the video recorder. So yeah, I think this is.
Well, I'll shout for
for-
the sake of the room.
Yeah.
But thank you very much to our speakers. It's been a
Thank
really
you.
interesting session. There's so much going on here that we could talk about for ages. And thank you also to Noah and BeLife for organising this week and this session. It's always amazing what you managed to achieve there, Noah. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you everyone for attending. I'll see you next year, if not before.
Bye bye. Thank you very much.